Hey everybody, welcome back to Language of the Bible. I'm Harry, and today we're beginning a new series which I'm calling Straight from the Source, where we focus on one piece of extra biblical literature. And by extra biblical, I mean something that's not part of the Christian canon, that is the 39 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, nor the 27 books of the New Testament or the Greek Scriptures. Strictly speaking, we're talking about sources that are not canon, that are either Jewish or Christian in origin, and contribute historically, theologically, culturally, and shed lots of insight on the vocabulary that we find in Scripture, on the concepts that we find in Scripture. They help to fill in the blanks as far as some of the historical criteria that we need to assess in our study of the Scripture, but they in and of themselves are not Scripture. They are not canon. They are not authoritative for formulating any particular doctrine. But again, they're useful. So for today, we're starting this series with the first piece of extra biblical literature, and it's actually technically not extra biblical because it's actually a translation of the Bible, and that is the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the first translation ever of the Bible from one language into another, and in particular, this was a translation of the Old Testament because this translation took place 250 years before the time of Jesus, about 300 years before there was any New Testament documents ever written. So at this time, there only was an Old Testament, and the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, but the Greek Septuagint, I just spoiled it, the Septuagint was translated into the Greek language because around 250 BC, this was the dominant language, the lingua franca in the Mediterranean world. Alexander had conquered that part of the world, and he had spread through the process of Hellenization. He had spread the culture, the religion, and especially the language across all the surrounding regions. So what happened was the lore behind the Septuagint is that 70 or 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem came over to Alexandria, which was a major city in Egypt at the time, and that this project was endorsed by the librarian of Alexandria, and these 70 or 72 scholars partook in the translation of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And over the course of the next 30, 40, 50 years, they worked on translating those 5 books from the Hebrew into the Greek. Then another 50 years later or so, around 200 BC, we finally started to get the prophets. That's the next major section of the Hebrew Scriptures. The prophets were translated from the Hebrew over into the Greek. And then finally, around 150 BC, we get the writings, which like the Proverbs and the Psalms and Ecclesiastes. These were translated from the Hebrew into the Greek. So by the time of Jesus, the diaspora, that is the Jews that are not living in Judea, the Jews that are not living in Palestine, the Jews that are living all around, spread throughout the Mediterranean, through the Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, these Jews are probably speaking Greek as their primary language, and the Septuagint was conducive for that purpose, to make the Scripture of the Jews available to these second, third, fourth generation Jews who are being born outside of Palestine in the diaspora, where Hebrew is not their primary language. Now, not only does this accomplish that purpose of providing the Scripture for these Jews outside of a Judean context, but it also provides a Bible in the language of the people for the purposes of evangelization. And although evangelism was not a big thing necessarily in Jewish circles, there was some evangelism taking place. It's where we get the word proselytizing from. The Jews were proselytizing Gentiles. They were converting them over to Judaism with full-blown circumcision involved as well. And the Septuagint was a major component for that evangelism because it made the Hebrew Scriptures that would have been so foreign to these Gentiles readily accessible in the language of their own speaking. And again, it paved the way for the New Testament, because not only does the New Testament borrow lots of its language, the words that the Septuagint translators used to translate the Hebrew into the Greek, not only did the New Testament authors borrow that vocabulary, But quite often they were quoting and citing from Old Testament scriptures that correspond with the Septuagint translation of it. So in other words, where there were cases where the Hebrew text and the Greek Septuagint text may have been at odds, may have differed one from another, more often than not, the New Testament authors were choosing the Septuagint reading in order to quote and cite it in their writings. So the Septuagint was not only foundational and fundamental to the creation of the New Testament, but the Septuagint was the Old Testament for the early Christian church for at least 4 centuries, until the 5th century, where the Latin Vulgate became the predominant scripture, the #1 Bible for Gentile Christians. Before that, for 400 years, the Septuagint was the #1 translation for the Gentile Christians. So keep that in mind. So the Septuagint, again, very useful for the language that we find in the New Testament, the Old Testament quotations that we find cited in the New Testament, mostly or more often than not, they are from the Septuagint. And also, the Septuagint was the Old Testament for Gentile Christians for many centuries. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we will talk about specifically in a video sometime down the line, the Dead Sea Scrolls not only confirmed the antiquity of the Hebrew text, which is otherwise known as the Masoretic text. The Hebrew text was confirmed by this finding in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but so too was the reading of the Septuagint, because some of these manuscripts that were found in the Dead Sea, which are manuscripts in Aramaic and Hebrew, these correspond to readings that are particularly unique to the Septuagint and confirm the fact that there was Hebrew forlage, or Hebrew originals, underlying those Greek translations that we find in the Septuagint that again differed from the Masoretic text. And again, quite often the New Testament translators, when they faced this choice of picking either a Masoretic reading or a Septuagint reading, quite often they went with the Septuagint reading. So the Septuagint is just a very highly valuable source, resource for anybody who's doing New Testament studies or Old Testament studies alike. That's pretty much it for today's video. Please comment down below with any questions, any concerns, any thoughts, any disagreements, any prayer requests. We're here to listen, and God bless. Bye-bye.